Good morning all. Welcome to this peatland restoration webinar. I'm Rob Collins. I work for the Rivers Trust, and we are one partner organisation under an Interreg Northwest Europe project called Carbon Connects, and it's under that project that this webinar is being run this morning. We're going to be quite tight for time. And whilst we do have 5 or 10 minutes earmarked for Q&A at the end of the session, inevitably that's going to be eaten into somewhat. So if you have any questions or queries or comments as we go through the presentations, please put them in the Q&A, and the presenters will try and answer them as we go. The whole webinar is being recorded, and we'll make the link available to everyone in a few days' time. We've got a mixture of recorded and live presentations, and we'll kick off now with a brief overview from me of what is really pretty broad and complex topic area. So if we can kick off with that, please. Hi, good morning, and welcome to this peatland restoration webinar. I'm Rob Collins. I work for the Rivers Trust, and together with Weir Rivers Trust and North Pennines AONB, who you'll be hearing from shortly, both of them, we're partner organisations under an Interreg project, under Interreg Northwest Europe, called Carbon Connects, which focuses upon various aspects of peatland restoration, including business models, restoration at several pilot sites, and also engagement with a wide range of key stakeholders. And it's under that project, Carbon Connects, that we're running this webinar today. This is obviously a very short, succinct overview. We're only going to run for 1 hour, but we intend to run a longer, more comprehensive event at some point over the coming months. Just not sure when that'll be, but we'll keep you all posted. As we go along, feel free to record any questions or queries or challenges you might have in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have time at the end of the webinar just to address some of those, or we might do that as we go. But if you have also any queries or questions beyond the after this webinar, please get in touch with any one of us presenters. So I'm going to kick off with a really brief overview of what is a pretty broad issue. But I'm going to draw on, in the next few slides, a report that we did, a guidance report just a few months ago for catchment partnerships covering this broader issue of peatland restoration. And I've put a link to that report here on this opening slide, together with the link to the Carbon Connects project website. So UK peatlands, they've obviously sequestered a huge amount of carbon over millennia, but according to the IUCN, 80% of UK peatlands are now damaged in some way. Most of them are drained. Some have had quite a bit of historical peat extraction. And there's a report out 2 or 3 years ago, led by Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, that's basically a peatland emissions inventory. So they've quantified greenhouse gas emissions from UK peatlands, and found that actually they're a net source of emissions, and that in particular lowland cultivated peatlands, the likes of which we see in East Anglia, emit a disproportionate amount of emissions. So that arable cropland on peat occupies something like 7% of the UK peatland, but contributes about slightly more than 30% of UK peat greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's an issue there, because that's obviously some of our more fertile land in the UK. And to attempt to square that circle, DEFRA have recently established a lowland agricultural peat task force. That's the bad news. The good news is that the UK natural capital accounts indicate that by restoring around 50% of our peatlands, that will realise net benefits of around £50 billion over the next 100 years. So a real considerable incentive to step up the restoration that we currently undertake. And of course, over the years, we've received life funding in the UK for peatland restoration, 3 or 4 large projects, and a steady stream of UK government funds as well, and the latest of which is the Peatland Grant Scheme that you may have seen. I've put a link to that here on the slide. And in the near future, there may well be other means as well, local nature and landscape recovery funding, ELM as well. But it's recognised pretty widely that we need private investment as well to see that step change in peatland restoration. And that comes with its own challenges. And I'll come on to that in a moment. So how do we go about peatland restoration? Well, our uplands, upland peatlands are pretty well drained in places, and that has lowered the water table. It's dried out vegetation, meant it's died off, and that exposes a peat to erosion and gullying, as you can see here in the photograph, and a network of preferential flow pathways. So to address that, really, you have to sort of put the whole thing into reverse and establish a more natural water balance. And that's done typically by putting in a whole load of leaky dams using natural materials, coir, hay bales, wood, stone, and so on, that allow some water through, but also trap a lot of particulate material behind the dam and allow the whole gully to build up again. And then by adding brash as well, that helps to keep the moist, keep the peat moist, protect it from erosion, and help the re-establishment of, for example, Sphagnum mosses. Our lowland peatlands are more challenging because, as I said, that much of these are cultivated on very fertile soil, and we can improve soil carbon, of course, through cover crops and manures and the way we tillage a soil or lack of it. And there are measures we can use also to trap soil and hence carbon eroded from these lowland peatlands and prevent it from being washed into rivers, so using buffer strips, for example. But fundamentally, what we need to be able to do is to restore the water table. And that's a challenge because that doesn't necessarily align very well with these sorts of arable crops, but there may well be some trade-offs we can undertake whereby, particularly in dry periods when the soil's pretty dried out, and we could maybe use alternative water sources to build soil water back up to full capacity and just reduce the level of emissions. In recent years, we've seen a number of economic sectors and global organisations, and actually quite small organisations as well, committing to net zero emissions. And some of those are now sort of scratching their heads to ponder just quite how they get there. And of course, carbon credit schemes and offsetting schemes offer a key mechanism here. And there are a few very rigorous gold-plated carbon credit schemes around the world. But these are sort of hampered by, firstly, a weak carbon price, but also the high administrative costs that come with the need for this rigorous system that needs a lot of validation, verification, and so on to ensure that you can match the funding to a very strong quantification of emissions reduction or carbon sequestration. But yeah, those have been quite limited, and there's a growing interest in more local or regional initiatives that maintain the scientific rigor, but reduce the costs associated with validation and verification through having the involvement of independent experts. And Moore's Futures in Germany is a really nice example of that. And the UK Peatland Code is sort of slowly evolving in that same way as well. And it's worth actually also remembering that corporate and social responsibility funds from big corporations can be important too here. And at the very least, they can begin to start an important conversation around credit schemes. Under Carbon Connects, we've been discussing and examining a lot of the additional ecosystem services that come from peatlands beyond simply the carbon sequestration. And these can be pretty important. Water quality in the UK, something like 40% of the UK population is served with drinking water that has pass through a peatland. And there's also, and so that's an important issue for water industry. So that peatland water can often end up coloured if you've had a lot of degradation of the peat and erosion and gulling and so on. Flood risk is another issue. I mean, peatlands in their natural form perhaps don't do a great job at alleviating flood risk because they're already saturated. They're already in a sponge-like state. But degraded peatlands certainly exacerbate flood risk. And there have been studies that show that that accentuates the movement of water across the landscape and can enhance peak runoff through having that degradation. So reversing that can do something about addressing flood risk. And there are plenty of other ecosystem services besides recreational, biodiversity, archaeological, and so on, educational too. The challenge is trying to value these ecosystem services and put a monetary value on them, or accrued monetary value at least. And that's not easy, but it's worth exploring. And Leeds University, for example, have had a good go at trying to do that. And there's a report they've written, I've linked to in one of my final slides here. So whether restoration interventions are funded through research, public or private, they will require some estimate of a baseline condition and restored emissions condition to determine the reduction anticipated and over a particular period of time. And this is where peatland restoration is something of a challenge in terms of trying to rigorously quantify the benefits. It's a little bit different when it comes to tree planting and quantifying carbon sequestration there. There's some nice harmonized tools that people have agreed to use, the Woodland Code, for example. There's no such equivalent yet in the peatland world. But information is growing, and where the quantitative information sources are steadily building, and we're getting a weight of evidence for emissions under various baseline, degraded, restore conditions. And they come from several sources, including UK Peatland Code, but also the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and various research studies too. So that quantitative understanding is growing steadily. And there are some neat additional approaches that are used. The guest approach, often used in the Netherlands and Germany, that takes vegetation and water table to infer emissions. And in fact, it underpins one particular credit scheme. And there are also various tools now, on-farm carbon calculators that can help build a quantitative picture out there. So this is, things are improving, but we're not quite there yet. So that hopefully gives you a useful and very brief overview of what is really a pretty complex topic. But I provided here around 15 links to various reports, guidance documents, projects, and so on that hopefully can be some help. Thank you. We'll move swiftly on there. So that's a very quick run through of obviously a very broad topic. Just to say that if you've got queries and questions and any follow-up points, then please feel free to get in contact with any of us presenters once the webinar is over. But we'll move on straight away to my colleague Anneka France, who'll be talking about the challenges of data around peatlands.
There we go, managed to unmute myself. Hi everyone, I'm Anneka and I work for the Rivers Trust and I'm part of the data and evidence team. I've been working on the Carbon Connects project, but I also am part of the catchment-based approach sort of technical support team. And we help people to access and interpret data and use that in their catchment planning. And part of that is collating data for the covered data package, which some of you may be aware of. And as part of the Carbon Connects project, we've been looking into the availability of data on peatlands and most specifically their extent, which can be quite difficult to find. So just going to get my slides up. The real question is, why do we need data? The main reason to collect the data is that we need it for planning strategic restoration and also for targeting support to land managers and farmers for transitions to more sustainable land management practices, especially where restoration to full peatland habitat may not be possible. It also allows us to identify opportunities to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, which can be a fairly major driver for peatland restoration. But it also helps us to realise the potential for other ecosystem benefits that can come from peatland restoration, and that can help to create blended finance opportunities. So where there's not necessarily enough funding available to purely fund peatland restoration for emissions offsetting or habitat, you can look at other benefits as well that Rob mentioned in his presentation. And then really importantly as well, maps also allow us to avoid potentially damaging activities such as tree planting and forestry on peatlands, which could compromise the hydrology and lead to further degradation and further emissions of greenhouse gases. So there's approximately 1.5 million hectares of peatland in England, and that's equivalent to the whole land area of Northern Ireland. It's really significant, but typically we only really think of our upland peatland bogs, and quite often we're ignoring this sort of lowland peatland and the soils that have peaty pockets rather than just the deep peat. So our most comprehensive map of peatland soils at the moment for England is currently only available on request from Natural England on a non-commercial licence. So in England, we don't have an open peatlands map. And this data set that was actually created for a report by Natural England back in 2010 called England's Peatlands, Carbon Storage and Greenhouse Gases. It's a really, really useful data set, and it's not well advertised that you can access this data. But to access it, you can send a request to data services at Natural England. I've popped the email address in there, but you can also find it online if you go to the Natural England website. So the problem with this data is that it's derived from the National Soils Research Institute soils data, which is held by Cranfield University. And this is actually a privatized data set, which is very, very expensive to license. And it's only available, even if you pay for a license, it's only usually available for a single user for a fixed term, usually 1 year at a time. And as a result of this licensing, the peatland map can't be shared or redistributed. And any products that you derive from it, so if you did any analysis or created any maps using the data, then those layers would also be subject to the strict licensing restrictions. But the good news is that a more up-to-date and detailed peat map of England is going to be released by 2024, according to the new England Peat Action Plan, which was released in May this year. So fingers crossed that will be available soon. And it's well recognised now that peatland restoration is going to be a really important driver for us, and that we need the maps publicly available and accessible and shareable so that we can drive action on the ground. So if you're looking for a layer which is open data and that you can share freely and use with partners, what we found to perhaps be the best proxy is the priority habitat inventory from Natural England. And this shows where the peatland habitats are. But the problem is that it significantly underestimates the geographic extent of lowland peat and fringe areas surrounding the blanket bogs. And that's likely due to the fact that lowland peat soils and fringe areas have been heavily degraded over many years, usually as a result of unsustainable land use practices. And that means that it's actually really important to capture these fringe areas and the lowland peat, because we know it's under more intensive land use, and that's where we could potentially have a greater impact with restoration or more sustainable land practices. But nevertheless, this data set is suitable for identifying the extent of the existing peatland habitats, and that's really important so that we can help protect and enhance those areas and increase carbon sequestration and maximise the benefits of other ecosystem services. So the Natural England data set, which I just showed you from their report on peatlands and greenhouse gases, has some really useful maps within it. So it provides us with estimates of soil carbon in tonnes per hectare, which is really useful, and it actually shows you just how much carbon is actually stored in those lowland peat areas. However, obviously these figures are only estimated at this national scale, and we would recommend that local soil sampling and surveys would be the most effective way to determine carbon stocks if you're looking on a site-specific basis. But this can be a really good place to start and give you an idea of what there might be in the area that you're focusing on, or where you'd like to target your work. So a recent study showed that a 30-centimetre peat layer can store at least the same amount of carbon as tropical rainforest over the equivalent area. And that just shows that, you know, prioritising only the peat bogs or upland peat needs to be a thing of the past, and we need to start looking at the lowland peat areas and fringe areas as well. So then we can look at where the greatest emissions are. So again, they provide estimates of carbon dioxide emissions in tonnes per hectare. And the really significant thing here is that the arable cropland and grassland, so in those fringe areas and lowland peatland, occupies just 15% of the total peat area in the UK, yet it accounts for 59% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from peat. So while restoration work to date has been focused on those upland bogs, targeting the lowland and fringe areas will potentially have the greatest impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions going forward. So available in the same data set, they've got some layers on evidence of damaging land practices, and that can be a really good way to work out what sort of interventions you could use. It should be noted though that these are really old data sets now, so obviously use them with a bit of local knowledge as well, but it helps to show areas where there's evidence of things like forestry, rotational burning, cultivation, or where there's been historic peat cutting. And it can also show where there's been pollution, which can inhibit the peat forming habitats. So there's lots of useful information there, and I'd recommend everyone take a look. But if you're not in England, there are peatland maps available for both Wales and Scotland. So Wales recently, I think it was last year, released a new unified peat map of Wales, which is available on the HLE geoportal. The only limitation of that layer is that that only shows peatland extent. It doesn't have any information on condition or any other factors or greenhouse gas emissions. They are launching a new peatland strategy though, and I know that there's been sort of a new team forming in Wales. So I think keep an eye on that space and there'll be some really useful data coming out soon. There's a carbon and peatland map for Scotland, which is available from the Scottish Soils website. Again, I don't think it contains necessarily information on emissions. But for Northern Ireland, there's actually no publicly available peat or soils map at the moment. However, you can contact the AFBI for licensing information and prices. And I believe they've worked in partnership as well with Cranfield University. And that's it from me.
Thanks, Anneka. Yeah, complex world of data. If we move swiftly on to Kate now to give a quick overview of peatland restoration in an upland setting in the North Pennines.
Hi everyone, my name's Kate Cartmell-Done and I'm a peatland support officer for the North Pennines AONB partnership. Today I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the peatland restoration techniques that we use here in the North Pennines and also talk to you about how we use drones in our peatland restoration work. The North Pennines AONB is in the northeast of England and we're the second largest AONB. We also have the largest area of contiguous bog, and this red outline shows the boundary of the AONB, and all of the blue within it is peatland. Of this, there are 2,900 hectares of bare and eroding peat that requires restoration, and also 10,000 kilometres of grips, which are moorland drains. The AONB first began restoring peatlands 15 years ago, and to start with, the focus of the peatland programme was grip blocking. Grips are moorland drains that were put in after the war to try and improve agricultural productivity, and they have had a negative impact on peatlands, making them much drier, changing the vegetation community, and generally causing degradation. So grip blocking was a really important priority when we first started. And this photo shows on the left grips that have not been blocked yet. You can see they're clear, they're still active, and on the right you can see grips that have been blocked, with the dark shadows being the pools that form behind each of the dams. And the dams are made from peat using diggers, and it's a really effective way of blocking up the grips and slowing the flow of water off the moor. After most of the grips in the AONB had been blocked, the AONB started looking instead at trying to restore the areas of bare peat. So this photo on the right shows a typical bare peat site in the North Pennines, and it features really deep erosion gullies, hag edges, and also just large areas of continuous bare peat. So the AONB developed a 5-step approach to restoring bare peat sites, and I'll give you a brief overview of that now. So the first step is to try and stabilise the hydrology of a site, to raise the water table and re-wet the peatland. So to do that we need to slow the flow through the erosion channels that are formed, and we do this with leaky dams made from stone and coir rolls. And this allows sediment as well as water to build up behind the dams, and from there vegetation can start to grow back. And this works really well for limiting the amount of erosion, stopping any more peat from being washed away by slowing the flow of water through the channels. The second step is to try and stop any more erosion happening on the hag edges. So hags are steep faces of eroding peat, and we use diggers again to change the angle of these slopes, make them much more gradual, and this stops any further erosion from happening, and it also means that vegetation can start to return. So you can see in this photograph on the left is where the digger has already been and reprofiled, and on the right is the steep hag edge, which is waiting to be reprofiled. The third step is heather brash, and this is a really important step for us and one that works very effectively. And this is where we harvest healthy peatland vegetation, so heather, cotton grasses, mosses and sphagnum mosses. We cut those from donor sites, which is also a way of managing heather, and then we bag it up and fly it over onto restoration sites, and then we spread it by hand with pitchforks. And this works really, really well. It helps to stabilise the peat. It stops any more erosion from occurring by protecting it from weathering, and also provides a seed source and a growing medium, which allows plants to start to grow back. And you can see in this photo on the left we've got the brash that's been spread onto the bare peat, and on the right bare peat with the bags of brash waiting to be spread. The fourth step is where we try to kickstart the process of vegetation and give it a bit of a boost. So we use small amounts of lime and fertiliser and a mullein seed mix, and we spread that over the brash to try and speed up the process of revegetation. And again, this is something that we found really helps with the speed of things, and also many of the sites within the North Pennines are really acidic, too acidic for anything to germinate very well. So by putting on small amounts of lime, we can raise the pH slightly and give things more of a fighting chance. So the final step is reintroducing sphagnum moss to areas where it's lacking, and sphagnum moss is a really important bog species. It's probably the most important bog species. It's the primary peat builder, and peat is obviously how carbon is stored in bogs and sequestered into bogs, so it's very important for climate change as well. Sphagnum moss can also hold 20 times its own weight in water, so it's really useful for retaining water, mitigating flood risk further downstream, keeping the water table high, so allowing other plants to colonise as well, and also reducing the risk of wildfire. So there's loads of benefits for it, and it's a very typical bog species. And there's a few different ways that we reintroduce this. This is the main technique that we've been using on our Carbon Connects pilot sites, and one of these techniques is to use sphagnum plugs, which we buy in from specialist suppliers, and that's what you can see in this picture here. So they're just small little plugs of sphagnum that we plant into the bare peat, and we buy these in. There are some issues with the supply of sphagnum plugs and trying to get hold of enough of them, because there are so many restoration projects in the UK now, and Peter is going to go into this in a bit more detail in his presentation. Another technique we've been using on our Carbon Connects pilot sites is sphagnum clumps. So you can see in this photo on the left, these are bigger than sphagnum plugs, and we basically harvest handfuls of sphagnum from healthy donor sites, and then we plant them into the bare peat on our restoration sites. So similar to the brash, but a much smaller undertaking. And these work really well, I guess, because they're already bigger and more established when we plant them. They spread pretty quickly, and this photo on the right is after only a year or so of growth. So after we've completed all of those 5 steps of restoration, this is typically what a site will look like immediately after restoration. So all of the bare peat is covered with the brown brash. You can see the stone downs in the bigger gullies, and the coir rolls in the slightly smaller erosion channels. And then we hope that after a couple of growing seasons, we'll get something a bit more like this. So the photo on the left, you can see it's summertime, the brash is very dry, but this is what helps keep the peat moist underneath and helps the plants to grow. And then 2 years later, everything's sprung into life, and we've got a really successful, well-vegetated bare peat site. So it's a very effective 5-step process. I'll move on now to talking about drones and how we use UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, in our work. And this is something that we've been doing for a few years now, and it's really useful for helping us to do things on a wider scale and appreciate how our restoration work, what impacts it has on a bigger scale than we can ever see from the ground. So one of the things we use UAVs for is obtaining aerial photographs, and the photos we can get from our drone are much more accurate than those that we can get commercially or from satellite images. So this means that when we use our aerial photographs to make restoration decisions, hopefully our restoration work is much more accurate. So on the left, you can see here that we have identified all the areas of bare peat within a restoration site, so we know how much brash we're going to need to cover that. And on the right, we've identified all of the flow pathways, so where the water runs through the site and where will be the best places to put in our stone dams and coir rolls. We also use UAVs for our monitoring quite a lot, so we can compare photographs taken in the same place year on year and see how a site is doing on a much wider scale. And it also enables us to see where further restoration work is needed or something hasn't worked well and we need to revisit it. And you can see here, this is a typical restoration site, and you can see the bare peat's reduced massively and is greening up really nicely. There are a few different avenues that we'd like to go down with our UAV work in the future that we're currently working on. One of these is species identification, so we'd like to be able to assess not only how much sphagnum is present on a site, but also the different species that are present. And for this we're using a multispectral camera. We'd also like to be able to assess how fast our plug plants are growing, so this picture on the left is of cotton grass plugs, which we also plant alongside the sphagnum. And finally, we'd like to be able to assess how quickly peat begins to build up behind stone dams and coir rolls. And this will also help us to decide when it's time to install more coir or more stone on certain sites. So that's a very brief whistle-stop tour of peatland restoration in the North Pennines. If you'd like any more information, then there is a lot more detail on our website as well as our social media, so please feel free to follow us there, and thank you very much for listening.
Great, thanks, Kate. That was excellent, really interesting stuff. And we'll move swiftly on to Peter, more on sphagnum and moss and grassland as well.
Thanks, Rob. I'm Peter Nailon. I'm the director of the Weir Rivers Trust and host of the Weir Catchment Partnership. So, hope people can see that. Okay, so we're looking at sphagnum and grass and maxing out on both. So the Weir Rivers Trust part of the Carbon Connect, working with the AONB partnership, is to broaden the sphagnum supply chain that Kate referenced earlier. So there's quite a shortage of peatland restoration material, particularly sphagnum, given the demand for peatland restoration products across the upland areas. And we're also looking at a pilot, a demonstration farm, to look at maximum sustainable output, which is based on maxing out on available natural grass. Most upland farmers have got in-by grassland as well as peatland areas, so looking at the whole farm. Sphagnum, it's very important plant. It's Kate has said it holds 20 times of its own weight in moisture, and it's got a lot of benefits, as she discussed. The supply chain itself is very narrow. It's almost monopolistic. There's a lot of peatland restoration going on. The Great North Bog has been established as an overall project area, and in order to achieve the potential for that, we need security of supply and also value for money. So what we've been doing is looking at a commercial scale pilot with Hoffel Agricultural College and exploring new ways to grow sphagnum, which is quite a specialist business. So we're looking to explore the proof of concept and then roll that out to commercial nurseries and learn the lessons that we can then pass on to a wider nursery audience. So we've done an additional 12-month trial period at a mothballed nursery at the college, utilising the college itself and the students. The moss was placed on commercial watering beds and established within glass houses, and various approaches were taken, as you can see there, and various growing media. So what we found from that is that evaporation is a key factor in water uptake. You can either kill the plants through overwatering, or it can dry out and die as well. We had issues with maintaining the pilot over COVID, as the college was closed, and there was a lot of issues around over drying and over wetting. It can be too warm, so we're looking to reduce direct sunlight and increase shade. As Kate has pointed out, hummocks are more effective than plugs, just due to the greater size, and it's combined with spraying or misting the plants. The media itself, the growth medium, is key to ensure a steady access to water for the plants. Essentially mimicking the conditions on the hill. So moving on to the second part of the presentation. So we've looked at sphagnum. We're also looking at grass. So this concept is called maximum sustainable output, or MSO. And the idea is that livestock numbers are limited to the natural free grass that's available on the farm. And the idea is that beyond MSO, marginal costs rise much faster than marginal revenue. So by producing more, you are producing less profit, or more likely, a greater loss. So what we have on the right is the standard economic theory of the firm. So we've got fixed costs, we've got our variable costs, and as production rises and fixed costs are ameliorated into higher production, we have the area of profit here beyond the break-even point. But what research has shown, and what this model is based upon, is the kink in the variable costs here. So the idea is that grass is free, and if you are putting hard feed into your stock, or you're putting artificial fertilizers onto your grass, then the variable costs rise at a much higher rate than your marginal revenues. So therefore you're carrying more stock with higher production, but making less money. So the benefits of this are that we can look for better business through reduced losses or improved profits. Less livestock will increase catchment roughness and improve soil health, and also it's positioned farmers well to take advantage of elms and potentially private payments for ecosystem services. So we have a demonstrator farm actually in the Eden catchment. We are looking at their farm accounts, or their annual accounts, from 2011 to November 2020. And what we're trying to do there is to isolate the direct farm business from the other enterprises that depend on a part of the overall farm business. So for example, this particular farm has got a camping site, it's got holiday cottages, it's got a fishing lake, it sells sheepdogs. It's quite a complex picture. And so what we're trying to do is to understand how the costs and the income are working within the farm, to then strip out the non-direct farm income and costs, and then to track those the operational changes that the farmers who've been running the farm from the parents, since 2011, to track their operation, to track their operational changes through the financial results that we have. And as part of that, we're looking to as I say, to recategorize income and costs across the business to inform decision making. So many, perhaps most farms, their annual accounts are there for business purposes and aren't particularly useful to inform management decision making. So if there's 2 or 3 or 4 business elements to an overall business based around the farm, then categorizing those incomes, that income and those costs by the separate divisions within the business aids decision making. What we're also looking to do through Carbon Connects, through the capitalisation or continuation of the project, which will run till September 2023, is then to assess and promote the ecosystem services produced by the farming operation to the corporate market, as well as providing those ecosystem services to secure government support through the new ELM system. And then, of course, we want to share any lessons learned with the wider farming audience. So what we're looking to do is to improve financial return from the direct farm operations, to position farmers to best utilise the ELM's opportunity around public money for public goods, to market high welfare, environmentally sustainable niche meat production, getting away where possible from commodity production and add value as part of the overall business, and also to attract private finance to support the ecosystem services resulting from that lighter footprint and that reduced production business model. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. That's some nice example of, I think, the potential for, building in carbon catchments almost, as it were, in the future. You mentioned ELM and public money, but also you mentioned the potential for private investment as well. So, I think things are going to be really moving rapidly in this field, actually.
So it's essentially three legs for the farm income. One is profitability. 2 is public money for public goods through ELMs, and 3 is the private finance being factored in to support farm incomes, to support and to encourage that good practice.
Yeah. We'll move on to my presentation, which is the final one on, Peter, if you could stop sharing your screen, which I think you have, which is focused on lowland, restoration of a lowland fen site. Hopefully you can all see that clearly. The number of logos on this opening slide tells you that this is a real collaborative effort, and funded through not only our Interreg project, Carbon Connects, but also the Coca-Cola Foundation. And that's a nice example of the CSR money I was talking about in my opening presentation, and not to sort of underestimate that as a potential means of funding, but also to start a conversation. So I think over the couple of years of this project, it's been fair to say that our discussions with Coke have sort of evolved, and now there's significant interest in the sequestration side of things and the monitoring, which I'll mention in a moment, not least because there's potential here for Coke to upscale. They run a number of sort of large wetland projects globally. But we work also with UKCEH and also Kent Wildlife Trust, who own the site, and also the local university, Christchurch Canterbury University. So this is Ham Fen. It's 2 or 3 miles inland from the Kent coast. It's near the town of Sandwich. It's Kent's last ancient remaining relic fenland, and it supports a huge number of really rare plant and animal species. It obviously stores an awful lot of carbon as well. But it's a typical story. Much of the original fenland has been lost through drainage over the last few centuries, conversion to grassland, and you can just make out the sort of creeping edge of arable agriculture to the right of this photograph as well. And as a result, a lot of the fen has seen a drying up of the soils. They've become mineralized and release carbon to the atmosphere. And so a lot of our work here has focused really on reversing this process and restoring the water table. And that's been done primarily through, well, there are a series of drains across the fen currently. And so what we've targeted is, along with Kent Wildlife Trust, is to block, or at least partially block, some of those drains up, and so they act as leaky dams and they help to back the water up and resaturate the water table. But there have also been a series of scrapes that have been created. So these are sort of shallow depressions that scrape off the more dried out mineralized soil and expose the peat. These hold water seasonally, and they have great biodiversity value as well. We've undertaken with Christchurch Canterbury University some monitoring of the water table. So there are a series of dip wells across the site, and those are monitored monthly. We might go to a higher frequency, we'll see. And if you interpolate that data using a GIS, you can get a reasonable estimate of the volume of water at the site at any one time. There is a challenge here in that it's really hard to discriminate the noise, if you like, of day-to-day or seasonal changes in water table due to changes in rainfall and weather patterns. And so that's the main signal we've got here, but it's actually quite difficult to then tease out the impact of the restoration effect on the water table from that seasonality. But this data is really useful in many different ways, and we're actually looking to feed it into a one-dimensional hydrological model to look at how the peatland retains water in the profile. We've undertaken quite a bit of soil monitoring as well at the site, and we've taken about 90 samples now of soil organic carbon, but also bulk density as well. And you can divide the site very roughly into 7 ecological units that more or less correlate with how degraded the peatland has become. And you can see, so this figure shows soil organic carbon in units of grams of carbon per kilogram of soil for those 7 units. And what it shows is, first of all, just how much variation you get at any one site. So for a given ecological unit that has broadly the same soil and vegetation type within it, you see huge variation. And that, of course, is one of the factors that makes sort of carbon credit schemes when it comes to soil quite challenging. But you can tease out some real differences too, despite that variation. And if you look at the exotically named Unit 3 there in the middle, that's basically the wetland proper, the fenland proper. And when you walk on that, you can feel it's very sort of mushy underfoot, really thick black soils. If you compare that to the site on the far right, Unit 7, that's the most degraded and mineralized site around Ham Fen. And if you can compare the 2 median values, so those are the horizontal lines in each case, you're seeing that actually that original fen is sort of around 150, slightly more grams of carbon per kilogram of soil. And the degraded site is kind of half that, roughly around 75. So you're seeing it gives you an idea of where the future can lie if you can get restoration going, and slowly, obviously, it would take some time to return soil organic carbon levels back up. We're also undertaking some work, or about to, this is where Centre for Ecology and Hydrology are coming into the project, undertaking some monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions across the site using these sensors. And we hope then to build up and add to that the CEH emissions inventory, actually. So we're going to look at emissions on the wetland proper, fenland proper, also in the Carr woodland, the wet woodland, and the wet grassland as well. And linked to that as well, we're going to install 2 or 3 of these peat motion cameras. So these basically put in a pole you can see down to the bedrock to act as a datum, and the camera basically monitors the movement of the peat. Obviously, it can move up and down really quite considerably with the water table as it wets and dries. So it's actually quite a nice way of looking at the water table, and hence inferring, you know, how oxidized the peat might be without actually having to take a whole load of water samples as well. So actually, the site has become something of a laboratory, really. We didn't quite intend it in that way in the very beginning, but that's how it slowly evolved, and some really interesting work going on at a low, you know, in contrast to the upland restoration you heard earlier. So I'll stop there on that particular lowland example, and we've nearly come to the end of our hour. Hopefully you found this of value, this very brief run through. There's an awful lot to this subject here, as I've mentioned before. I don't know if we can wrap up 1 or 2 of these final questions and chats in the last minute or 2 that we've got. But if not, please contact any of us presenters with any queries and follow-up questions you've got. We'll make the recording available, and have noted also that my mug was in the corner of some of my slides, so we can make all of the presentations available as PowerPoints as well. And importantly, there's a lot of really useful links in there as well. So I think we'll draw the webinar to a close now, just to thank all of you who have participated, and all the speakers as well, and to Becca for her help with the comms. And just to say, I think I mentioned it earlier in my first presentation, this has of course been a very quick overview, but we hope to run a longer, more comprehensive webinar, or perhaps even a face-to-face event, let's see, either in the autumn or possibly in the springtime, and that might also have an international component to it as well. So thank you all very much, and we'll look out for further information.